Sometimes you think you have a really good bit of content coming up, and things just don't quite work out the way you plan. But I'm going to see if I can make something out of this mess anyway. Uh, as you may have seen in the intro, went out to start the old Super Duty there, and she would not crank. So my plan was, okay, did a couple of tests. It was indicating that I had a bad starter, and my goal was to pull the starter out, tear it down, and show how you can save yourself some money by maybe trying to fix your starter yourself instead of just going out and spending the money for a new one, especially since a new starter for a 7.3 Power Stroke can be as much as $400. The cheapest I found was around $200. They're not exactly a cheap thing to buy. So the goal was to go out there, drop the starter, hook it up to a battery, see if the motor was bad, if the solenoid was bad, and go into the troubleshooting steps from there. However, when I go underneath the truck, pull the starter, get it out, look at the wires, and all that happened was the start wire that goes from the key down to the solenoid to engage the starter broke off. 2-minute fix. I didn't even bother taking video of it because, let's face it, who the heck wants to see me crimp a connector onto the end of a wire? If you don't know how to do that, you're definitely in the wrong place here. So what I'm going to do, though, is just kind of take from this here and uh, direct people away from the standard parts cannon approach of repairing problems with a vehicle. In this case here, it was fairly obvious what was wrong. Got underneath there, yeah, the wires broke right off. Not a big deal. So the but the way of troubleshooting this, and I'm sure if you've had a problem, you've gone on and looked up YouTube, and you find dozens or hundreds sometimes of videos of how to diagnose a particular problem. Sometimes, though, you run into something that's a little offbeat, and you may end up purchasing components that you actually don't need, and sometimes you end up tearing things apart you don't actually need to tear apart. So what I did here is, even though I could see that the wire was broken off, I still pulled the starter off, hooked it to a battery. Yes, the starter spun. Yes, the solenoid engages. Hooked it all back up, and the truck started cranking again just fine. Most of your starters, Ford has gone to this on the Super Duty, on the later ones, the 7.3s at any rate. And most of your GM starters and your Chrysler starters and so on have a starter solenoid that mounts on top of the starter that has a physical lever that pushes the gear into engage with the flywheel, applies power to the motor, cranks it to start the engine. Uh, 9 times out of 10, if you have what you think is a bad starter, actually all you have is a bad solenoid. So you can still buy these solenoids separately. There really isn't any reason to spend, $150, $200 for a complete starter motor if you can put power directly to that motor and it spins and it doesn't make any funny noises. Uh, Odds are you can just throw a solenoid on it that may be $20 to $50 and back together, and you're good to go for a number of years again. The whole point of my channel is not to throw tons of money at things. The name is Derelict Garage. I am working with vehicles that are cheap, broken down, not the best stuff in the world. You're not going to throw thousands of dollars at these cars to get them going. This is just basically old stuff, and you use your brain instead of your pocket to repair the vehicle. The troubleshooting, basically, if you can find a wiring diagram for electrical problems, that helps a lot. If you can find, the internet is a wonderful place. Pretty much anything you can think of, you can find out there. And you just need to gather enough information and then take a step-by-step routine to go through and find where the problem is before you start throwing parts at it. Because this is where I get some of my best deals on vehicles. is you get the guy that goes out and he's going, oh, I've put this part, I've done a tune-up, I've done a cap and rotor and plugs, and I put a starter in it, and it's a new battery, and it still doesn't want to run, and I don't know what to do. Well, that's because you didn't know what to do in the first place. If you take a methodical approach and figure out where your problem is, and then, like a roadmap, you just kind of have to zero in on where the problem is and replace only the things that are bad. If you start using the parts cannon and just throwing parts at it, all you're going to do is just empty your wallet, and you're not going to make the vehicle run. And then if you do happen to luck on and get it going, you still don't know exactly what the problem was in the first place, so you don't have any knowledge for down the road. The best troubleshooting method is to first figure out what's going on. With the Super Duty, I turned the key, you could see the gauges come on, it didn't crank. Okay, I'm not getting any power to my starter, or my starter is bad. On the Super Duty, there's a wire that you can unplug, and you can jump or power to it, and it should crank the engine. There's a million videos on how to do that. I'm not going to show you how to do that. It's because I don't feel like going back out and playing with it, I'll be honest. So, but if you can't get the motor to crank from there, now, in a lot of videos, they're just going to show you, oh yeah, I just jumpered this here and it didn't crank, the starter's bad. Well, not really, not always. In my case, it turned out the wire was broke down at the starter. It could have been bad solenoid. It could have been a wire break somewhere in between there. There's any number of things. You have to kind of determine what's going on. Now, if you can get somebody to help you out by cranking the key, you can go underneath there and you can measure voltage right down at that terminal on the back of the starter. When they turn the key, do you get 12 volts there? If you do, well, the solenoid is probably bad. If you don't, well, then you got a break in the wire. And most places where it's going to break is near a terminal end. It's very, very rare that a wire breaks somewhere in the middle unless it gets cut. It's usually going to be stressed at where the terminal is crimped on one end or the other. And sometimes you can find that just by pulling on the terminal, and the terminal pulls right off. That's basically what happened with my truck, is the wire just pulled right out of the terminal. So, put a new terminal on, check your voltage, hook it back up, boom, you're up and running. The other thing that can happen is, okay, you get power, the solenoid engages, but the motor doesn't turn. That doesn't necessarily mean that the motor itself is bad. The inside that solenoid, there's not only is there a lever that engages the gear, the starter gear, into the flywheel gear, there is also a set of contacts in there that takes the battery voltage and applies it to the motor to spin the motor. Those contacts are a wear item. They do wear out, and 9 times out of 10, when you have a starter motor that won't spin, it's because those contacts are blown out in that solenoid, not that the windings are bad in the motor. So if you can take and you can see where the wire is coming out of the motor and going to the back of that solenoid, and it's going to be under a big nut or something like that, you take and put 12 volts right to that. You can do this on the bench. You can do it in the car too if you want, but just keep in mind things are going to start spinning. You put a little voltage to that, and if the motor spins, and it spins freely, the starter motor itself is probably good. If it's kind of draggy sounding, or you got to bump it to make it turn, then the bearings are probably going in the motor, and in that case, your best bet is probably going to be to get a new starter motor. You could go and you could source bearings, which are usually just bronze bushings, and you can get into that. It really depends on what your skill is and how much patience you have. It is possible to completely rebuild a starter motor in your garage on your bench. It's not they're not a particularly difficult thing, but the goal here is just to determine what is wrong. And like I said, most of the time what's going to happen is that solenoid goes bad, and it either won't engage the starter or it doesn't apply power to the starter. And then you can go, and in many cases you can still get that solenoid. You can look them up, and you can get them through Rock Auto or local Napa store or whatever. There's a million places, Amazon, you can get these components. If you have a um, business in your area that rebuilds starters, you could also take that starter to them and tell them what tests you performed, and maybe just have them put a new solenoid on it, or buy a solenoid from them if that's what you feel is wrong. But at any rate, the goal here is that many times you can get things back up and running for a much smaller cost than what most people tend to do just by throwing tons of money and tons of parts at a problem. The if you have an issue where the motor cranks but it doesn't start, you can go and get yourself a little can of that ether spray. You can use WD-40, pretty much anything that's flammable, and just squirt a little down the throttle body or down the carburetor, crank it. And I have a saying: if it farts, it starts. If it makes a pop, you know you have ignition and you got a fuel problem. If you shoot a little fuel down there, one of my favorite things is to pop a little hole in the lid of a empty pop bottle and throw a little two-stroke mix in there, especially for engines that have been sitting a while. A little oil in there, it doesn't hurt the upper end at all. It's kind of helps lube things up so you don't tear something up when you're starting an engine that hasn't been started in a long time. You can do that as well. But basically you want to put some kind of fuel in the engine, see if it gets spark. If it doesn't want to pop, now you're going to pull a spark plug wire, pull a coil wire, lay it near the ground on the engine somewhere, and have someone crank the engine over, or if you've got a remote start button, you can, little thing you wire up to the starter motor, you can crank it that way. But basically you want to crank it over, see if you get some spark. If you're getting some spark. One of the other things that you can do is you can pull the plugs out, lay them up on the intake somewhere where they'll ground, put the wires on it, crank it, see if you get spark at the plugs. You may have plugs that will fire in air but not fire in the cylinder. That's kind of a strange thing. But you can go and grab a spark plug that you know is good. And it doesn't have to be one that fits the engine. You can go grab the one out of your lawnmower, as long as it'll plug into the end of the spark plug wire. Put that in there, crank it, see if that sparks. If that sparks, then you know, okay, I've got an okay plug wire, I've got the distributor is okay, I have ignition. And at that point you can say, alright, I'm going to have to go and buy some spark plugs and put in here and get this engine started. So if you don't have spark, now you have to determine, do I have power getting to the coil? You get your voltmeter out, see if you have power getting to the coil. See if you have electronic ignition, you may be getting power to the coil and you get no spark. You start checking connections, find your ignition module, clean those connections up and all that. Basically, you want to do all the cheap, easy, free stuff first. Eliminate all the things that you can sit there and do without buying any parts. And then once you can reasonably say, okay, I have a good solid connection through here, I think my ignition module's bad. Or in a case of a Chrysler, I think I have a bad ignition resistor. Ignition resistor is easy to check. If you have an ohm meter on your voltmeter, put it on there and you measure the resistance. It's going to be one of two things. It's either going to be a really, really low amount, under 10 ohms, or it's going to be open. It's not going to change value where it's all of a sudden it's reading like several thousand ohms. It's basically going to be open, or it's going to be low resistance. If it's low resistance, it's probably good. You can also have, an intermittent connection on it. It happens. It's really kind of rare. That's fairly easy to check. You can just wiggle the connections around while somebody's cranking, see if you start getting spark. Again, it's the whole idea is to do the things that your labor is cheap. You can do this stuff for fairly cheap or for free before you go out spending parts. This also becomes more important the older the car is that you're working on. For instance, I have a 1976 Valiant. I was growing up, Slant 6 was like, they were everywhere. The parts were cheap. You could basically, walking down the street, kick some rocks, and oh, look, there's a ballast resistor. They're just everywhere. And now, not so much. Now, sometimes the stuff you might have to order it. You're not going to be able to go down to your local Pep Boys or AutoZone or whatever and just go and buy a new module. You'll find it, oh, well, we've got to order that. And now you've got to wait a week. And then you get it and you plug it in and it still doesn't work. Now you're going, oh, well, is the new one bad? Because that happens, because nothing is made. It's not even made in China anymore. It's made in India. It's made in Pakistan. It's made, everywhere. You have no idea where this stuff is coming from, what the quality control level is. And I have had a number of times brand new parts that were no good. But you can't just assume they're no good because you put it in and it still doesn't work. What is handy sometimes, over the years, I've built up a stack of parts that I call known good parts. I have ignition modules that I pulled out of running vehicles. I have ballast resistors. I have distributors. I have a variety of parts that I keep on hand that I don't put on a car and then send them down the road. I keep these because these are test items. Sometimes the quickest and easiest way to test something is to have a known good part. Now, if you're just starting out, this probably isn't going to be your best bet, but something to keep an eye out for is if you go to swap meets, go through the junkyard, start scavenging stuff and that, and you find distributors, you find ignition modules and so on, and they happen to fit the vehicle you have, pick them up, bring them home, plug them into your vehicle, see if they work. If they work, mark on it with a marker, known good part, and I know this operates. Put it up on the shelf. That's now a test item that you have. Don't put it on a car and send it down the road. That's a test item so that you know whether or not you need to buy a part. The goal with keeping old stuff on the road, keeping derelict vehicles on the road, is to use some common sense. Use your brain more than your wallet. The whole idea of this garage here is to give everybody an idea of how they can keep something that they've either had for years, just picked up, hasn't run in years, maybe ran forever and then one day just didn't start, but older stuff that not many garages want to take on anymore, that may not be worth a whole lot of money, that you don't want to sit here and take it in and pay a mechanic, $75 an hour to diagnose and repair. The older vehicles especially are fairly simple. They're basically big lawn tractors. They're an engine. An engine just needs fuel, spark, air, and it runs. Like to say, engines like to run. They don't like sitting around being idle. You give them the stuff they want, and they will run. There's really is no reason to be afraid of working on older cars, and especially don't be afraid of messing it up. You're probably going to. I have. I've messed a lot of things up. Basically, though, if you're doing the diagnostics yourself and you start building up a stock of known good parts for testing, about the only thing you're going to cost yourself if you mess up is some time. And the time when you're working on your own vehicles, hey, that's free. You're not doing this because you're trying to make a living at it. You're doing this because you enjoy it. If you're not enjoying this, then you should be doing something you do enjoy. If you're just absolutely hate going out to work on the vehicle, well, maybe you ought to get a newer vehicle that you're not going to have to work on as much, or that more shops are more inclined to work on. I tend to focus more on people that are doing this because they enjoy it. They enjoy the challenge of keeping older things on the road, and enjoy the thought process of diagnosing a problem. And with that there, I'm going to sign off on this episode. I was kind of hoping to have a little more actual hands-on video, but unfortunately, the problem I had really wasn't that big of a deal. And that's kind of a good thing, I suppose. So, good night and have a good day.